Good morning. Welcome to a brief study and overview of learning and behavior. In this presentation, we talk about how we learn from experiences, we define learning, and we relate it to the experiences. So let's begin with our learning goals and objectives. In this presentation, we define learning and compare habituation and sensitization, and we give examples. We also discuss basic elements of classical conditioning and talk about second order conditioning. We discuss stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, and discuss extinction, and also provide examples of each. We define operant conditioning and give examples. We define negative and positive punishment and reinforcement. We discuss and compare the different schedules of reinforcement. We discuss cognitive and biological factors that affect learning. And finally, we get into a discussion on observational learning and discuss the practical effects. And we relate it to the theory of sociocognitive learning as defined by Albert Bandura. So how do we define learning? Learning is defined as a change in behavior or knowledge that results from experiences. For example, a kindergartner may need to watch her father tie his shoes dozens of times before she understands how to do it herself. Or someone may have to watch someone put a puzzle together many times before they can do it themselves and repeat the behavior. That's just one example. There are many other examples that we can give. There are three kinds of learning that we discussed: operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and observational learning. And we will discuss each of these separately. Habituation is decline in the tendency to respond to an event that has become familiar through repeated exposure. The example here, you see the cat learning how to ride the tractor, drive the cat. Then he goes on and he's a little bit more familiar. And finally he says, I am no longer bothered by machines, because he has been repeatedly exposed to the machine. The noise at the beginning bothered him, then he got more sensitized to it, and it becomes habit through the repeated exposure. That is sensitization, a part of habituation. Now, sensitization is an increased responsive or sensitivity to an event that has been repeated. Repeated exposure to a stimulant. For example, fear of spiders. Everyone has some specific phobia or fear. Then fear of snakes is another area of sensitization that some people have a problem with. Here in this photo, you can see that this lady is being desensitized to her fear of snakes. And of course, he's being desensitized to his fear of spiders. Now, we talked about classical conditioning in one of the earlier units when we talked about Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physicist who began with the study of dogs in explaining what classical conditioning is. So he defines classical conditioning as learning that depends on associations between events, also called respondent conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. Here he says a subject comes to respond to a neutral stimulus as he would to another non-natural stimulus by learning to associate the two stimuli. Here in his experiment, here the dog is exposed to food before conditioning. Alright, so the food becomes the unconditional stimulus and the dog salivates. It becomes an unconditional response. Also, before conditioning, then a neutral neutral stimulus is added, the bell, which, and of course, he doesn't salivate, and that is an unconditional response. During conditioning, the neutral stimulus plus the food, which is the unconditional stimulus, leads to a response of salivation in the dog, which is still an unconditioned response. Now, after conditioning, the dog has learned to associate the food with the bell, and then the neutral stimulus is taken away, which is the food, and now the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, and now the bell has become a conditioned stimulus. He automatically salivates, which is now a conditioned response. That is classical conditioning, and of course he did it with other animals as well. Now, again, just to kind of recap what we just said, in Pavlov's experiment, salivation was the unconditioned response, which is a response that occurs naturally. The food was the unconditioned stimulus, which is a stimulus that naturally evokes salivation. Then the tone of the bell was the conditioned stimulus, which was stimulus that the dogs learned to associate with food. And the salivation is the conditioned response, usually the same as or similar to the unconditioned response. Don't get these confused because it can be very confusing. Now, higher order conditioning, or what is sometimes considered second order conditioning, here a neutral stimulus comes to act as a conditioned stimulus by being paired with another stimulus that already evokes a conditioned response. For example, now a black square, which did not produce salivation, was paired with ticking of the metronome. No unconditional stimulus was presented. After the repeated pairings, the presentation of the black square began to produce salivation. So here, this is before conditioning, which led to an unconditional response. Here, the second order stimulus, which is the black square, was added to the metronome, which is a conditioned stimulus, led to the conditional response. And now this stimulus has been taken away, and now he's only presented with the black square, which elicits salivation. Now, stimulus generalization is a little different. John Watson in the 1920s and his partner Rayner were researchers, and they did a famous study that demonstrated stimulus generalization by giving a white rat to an 11-month-old little boy named Little Albert. This was the famous Little Albert experiment. Now, he liked the rat and he enjoyed playing with it, but in the next stage of the experiment, they repeatedly made a loud noise behind Little Albert while giving him the rat. And each time, Albert fell to the floor and became frightened. And when the researchers offered the rat to him without making the noise, Albert showed fear of the rat, and he crawled away from it. Stimulus discrimination, researchers were able to generalize here that Albert's fear to the furry rat, which was a white rat, and everything furry, white, including a rabbit, a dog, or a fur coat, or Santa Claus mask. And even Watson's own hair, he learned to fear that. Now, extinction. Extinction is when the unconditional food does not follow the conditional stimulus or the tone. salivation begins to decrease and eventually causes extinction when it goes away. So in classical conditioning, extinction occurs when the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus are not paired. So here he does not have the unconditional stimulants to lead him to that conditioned response. Spontaneous recovery. In classical conditioning, spontaneous recovery occurs when there's a re-emergence of an extinguished conditioned response after a period of time or rest. Recall, extinction occurs when a previously conditioned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappears. And in recovery, after a certain period of time, and he is re-exposed, then he automatically responds to it. Here in the little cartoon, conditioning, here comes my food, here is taken away, then extinction, he pays no attention to the bell, and then in the spontaneous recovery here, he gets excited again because the bell and the food is now there. Now recall, classical conditioning is when there is an association between a pairings of conditioned response with conditioned stimuluses, unconditioned response, and unconditioned stimuluses. In opera conditioning, this is a learning process in which there are consequences that follow a response, determine whether the behavior will be repeated. So opera conditioning is about consequences and behavior. Behavior will likely be repeated, which has been reinforced, and tends not to be repeated with punishment. And in this diagram, you see the ABC of operant conditioning. Antecedent means what happened before, which recalls the behavior, which leads to consequences. Okay? Now, when we talk about behavior in operant conditioning, we talk about negative and positive reinforcement, negative and positive punishment. And these can also be very confusing. Reinforcement is something that you want a desirable behavior to increase or get better. And then punishment is taking something away. So in positive reinforcement, you're adding something valuable or something desirable that the child wants. And then in positive reinforcement, you are avoiding something unpleasant. In punishment, positive punishment, you are adding something unpleasant that the child doesn't want to do. And in negative punishment, you are removing something valued or desirable. And there are many examples that we'll talk about in class and in your handout that you have been given. Now, we'll talk about schedules of reinforcement. This is like how often we reward or reinforce behavior. So there are different kinds of reinforcement schedules that you will have to know for your exam. In a continuous reinforcement, a reward is given after each desired behavior. Every time a person does something positive, you reward them. And then the effects of this reinforcement, there's fast learning of new behavior, but rapid extinction. And then the complements, that is continuous. At a fixed interval, the reward given at fixed time intervals. Average and irregular performance with rapid extinction, such as weekly paychecks. That is a fixed interval. Now a variable interval, reward given at variable time interval. All right, the effects of this one, the moderately high and stable performance with slow extinction, like pop quizzes. And with a fixed ratio, reward given at fixed amount of output. High and stable performance attained quickly, but also with rapid extinction every 3 lever presses, every nth time something is done. with a variable ratio, reward given at variable amounts of input. Very high performance with slow extinction. For example, 1 to 2 responses or 2 to 5 responses that the person is rewarded. Now, there are many factors that affect learning. There are cognitive factors that affect learning, processing and goal-realized self-efficacy sources of information. And a lot of these cognitive processes have a lot to do with our thought patterns and how we learn. Biological factors can include anything with that affects age. So age is a prime biological factor in learning. Hearing deficits, vision deficits. If a child can't see well, then that can also affect learning. Social cognitive theory. Albert Bandura was a social cognitive scientist whose theory emphasized reciprocal influences of behavior, environment, and person, and cognitive factors. And he said all of this has to do with the social learning part of our lives. He said the behavior, environment, and the person. Now, this was first discussed by him while other people watching, noting positive and negative consequences of their actions, then imitating these actions, learning to shake hands, dance moves. Classical and opera conditioning also occur, he says, indirectly through vicarious conditioning. Hence, modeling is not totally separate. And here are examples of observational learning and modeling. Learning through observation process. Example, learning to drive a car. Here, he's imitating, observing dad mow the lawn. Dance moves. She's imitating the dance move of the instructor. So it's observational learning, modeling, and imitating. Finally, one of his most famous experiments of modeling, his bubble doll experiment. They showed these children that children frequently imitate the aggressive behavior that they observe. So in the top row, they see an adult model strike a clown doll. Then in the lower row shows a boy and a girl imitating aggressive behavior. And so this is why it's very important that anything that you want children to model or imitate, it must be done in a positive manner. And there are many other examples that were given, like watching violent TV shows. Many experiments have been done to determine whether that had a lot to do with the aggressive behavior of children. So this is just a brief overview of this chapter on learning and behavior, which we discuss more in depth in class. And following this presentation, complete your 10 quiz multiple choice questions.